headquarters of Talasio English in Quito, Ecuador. This is From the South, and I am Soini Gray. After the death of a second Guatemalan child in U.S. custody, the government has announced medical checkups for every migrant child under their care. Every month, Customs and Border Protection custody processes thousands of minors, both accompanied and unaccompanied, and they rarely receive medical care. And now the international community and human rights groups are criticizing the U.S. administration after 2 minors died without appropriate medical care while under the custody of U.S. immigration. An 8-year-old migrant child died on Tuesday in a New Mexico hospital. He was diagnosed with a cold and a fever and had been taken back into custody, but he was soon returned to hospital with nausea and vomiting. He had been in U.S. Customs and Border Protection custody since December 18th after being separated from his father. His father, Agustin Gomez, is still in detention.
I believe that things could have been handled differently.
Our correspondent in Guatemala City, Mario Rosales, brings us the latest.
The Human Rights Office in Guatemala has published a statement condemning the death of a second migrant child in U.S. custody in less than 2 weeks. The child was an 80-year-old and was arrested at the Mexico-U.S. border alongside his father on December 18th, whilst trying to cross the border into Texas. It has been reported that the child had a fever and was vomiting, like in the case of Jacqueline Cal. In the afternoon of December 24th, as Jacqueline's funeral was being prepared in her hometown, this second case made headlines. The Human Rights Office here in Guatemala is asking the government to oversee the investigations the United States is conducting to determine what happened with Jacqueline Cal and with this second child.
And the family and friends of Jacqueline Cal have bid their final goodbyes to the 7-year-old Guatemalan migrant who died in U.S. custody earlier this month. Jacqueline was laid to rest on Christmas Day in San Antonio Secotes after her body was repatriated from the United States. Previously, relatives and neighbors held a wake for the child. Jacqueline's death raised many questions about how migrants are treated at the hands of U.S. immigration authorities. And let's hear from our correspondent in Guatemala, Santiago Boton, who attended Jacqueline's funeral.
Yet another burial is carried out as a result of migration. This time, it's for Jacqueline Rosemary Cal McQueen, the 7-year-old indigenous Mayan girl who died under the custody of the Border Patrol Agency in the United States on December 8th. She was buried on the afternoon of the 25th because it symbolizes the sunset of life as it is interpreted in Mayan culture. Her wake lasted 24 hours and was held in the home she left over a month ago. According to Santiago Putul, one of the people I spoke to during the funeral, the child's death came only after her father tried to run away from the misery and neglect this community suffers at the hands of the Guatemalan government. One of the Catholic ministers who attended the funeral, Juana Tot, also told us that extreme poverty sentenced the child to one of 2 painful destinies: death or becoming another teenage mom. A story that's very common for children in neglected areas such as this.
We thank Santiago Poton for that report. Meanwhile, U.S. immigration officers have left over 400 undocumented migrants outside a bus terminal in the city of El Paso without notifying shelters. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers began dropping off migrants held in detention on Sunday night at the bus station without notifying local shelters, which usually take in large groups of asylum seekers. The total number of people left outside could exceed 800 by Wednesday. Local organizations have managed to house the people released so far. And U.S. President Donald Trump has said the partial government shutdown will continue until his demands are met for funds to build a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. And he has also once again mocked migrants, saying that once the wall is finished, it would take an Olympian to jump over it.
The only thing that stops it's a wall. And when the Democrats talk about a wall, does it mean anything? Well, in Israel, they had a big problem. They put up a wall. 99.99% of the people were stopped from coming in. And we'll have the exact same thing. And we have a long, long border. but we'll have the exact same thing. Now, there may be the case of an Olympic champion who can get over the wall, but for the most part, it's you're not able to do it. Very high, it's going to be 30 feet. Much of it is 30 feet high, some of it's lower. But in some areas, we have it as high as 30 feet. That's like a 3-story building.
Switching gears now, temporary relief shelters have been set up in Indonesia's Java Island for victims of Saturday's devastating tsunami. This is part of an effort to prevent the spread of diseases. Besides ongoing search and rescue efforts, disease control has become the most important issue on Java. On top of medical care, psychiatric therapy is also being provided for victims grieving their many losses. The death toll has so far risen to 430. According to doctors, the spread of diseases is common following a tsunami.
I am certain the tsunami will bring some diseases, as usual. We need to help prevent post-tsunami diseases. Residents evacuated from a tsunami-hit area can develop illnesses including diarrhea, fever, cough, cold, and skin diseases.
And as relief efforts continue, shelters are starting to struggle with the rising number of victims and evacuees. Over 1,000 tsunami survivors are staying in a futsal stadium being used as a temporary shelter. Authorities have begun asking for help to assist the people in those shelters. We'll have a short break now. More news in a minute.
The ruling world order has always subjugated the masses. But who are the actors behind every move? What are their real interests? We analyze every move on Critical Move. Weekdays, only on Telesur.
Welcome back. This year, Cuba marked the end of an era when it elected its new president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, who committed to lead the fight against imperialism as Cuba faces renewed tensions with the United States.
Street vendors make their living, and the streets of Havana are busy as always. This is Cuba. More than 50 years after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution and the economic blockade imposed soon after by the United States. But business must go on. After the death of Fidel Castro, the leader of the Cuban Revolution, Cubans have an even bigger challenge ahead. Fidel's brother Raúl announced it would be his last term in office as president of Cuba during a meeting of the National Assembly, and that following a democratic process, Cubans would elect their new president.
When the National Assembly of Popular Power convenes on April 19, 2010, I will have finished my second and last mandate at the head of the Cuban state and government. And Cuba will have a new president.
People across Cuba voted in these elections. After taking part in several assemblies, they were able to propose and then choose their candidates. Children guarding the ballot boxes held up their hands in a signature gesture to show that a vote had been held. Expectations were high for the new leaders about to be elected.
I want someone, anyone, to lead this country well. And the most important thing is good leadership. people who are going to protect Cuba.
The name of Miguel Díaz-Canel emerged as the favorite to win the election. At 58, he had served as Minister of Education and was part of the State Council of Cuba. He'd been a vice president and had experience working with youth groups in the island.
We are defending our process, the revolution that continues to be threatened and attacked, in the middle of a complex situation in the region, and as we change our economic system.
Díaz-Canel was elected on April 19 and was the first person to be considered for the position who was born after the Cuban Revolution. He started working on implementing new economic reforms demanded by the Cuban people as they continue to face the hardships of decades of economic blockade.
He's doing what our commander Fidel Castro taught us. He's meeting with the people and getting to know what they think and how they live. I was able to shake his hand and I'm happy and grateful.
He's a man who shows that he is connecting with the people, that he is loved, that he is reaching out and
And with a new leadership came other changes. In another democratic process, Cubans gathered in neighborhoods, unions, student groups, and others to propose changes to their constitution. Everyone could take part, inside and outside the island, and millions put forward their own proposals. Díaz-Canel also led the debate inside the assembly, where the ideas of all citizens were taken into consideration and applied to the new constitution.
This exercise of direct participation by the people has the highest political relevance and will be another proof that the revolution is based on the most genuine democracy. And it's a major responsibility for all our people to participate actively and with awareness in the discussion of the Constitution of the Republic. All Cubans can express their opinions and contribute to achieving a constitutional text that reflects the present and the future of our country.
All across the 15 provinces of Cuba, issues of the economy, politics, and society were up for discussion, and a few topics stood out. The main one was to change how the Constitution defines marriage, no longer as a partnership between a man and a woman, and LGBTI groups were thrilled.
We are working with the state, with the Communist Party and society to educate people to change their minds and to make progress on these issues and their rights.
But in the international arena, Díaz-Canel still has to deal with the U.S. blockade. He led the vote at the United Nations, which year after year denounces it and calls on the U.S. to end it once and for all. And he denounced U.S. violations of human rights. But only 2 countries voted against it, the United States and Israel.
Cuba is proud of its human rights record, which denies any manipulation against it. On the contrary, the United States lacks the moral to give lessons, as much less in this manner.
In the end, the Cuban people will continue on their own path. The authorities say they expect growth of up to 2% in the Cuban economy. With tourism one of the main sources of income, they will continue singing and looking ahead to a better future and to the days when there's no more blockade and no more injustice.
Money, money, money. The government of Mexico has appointed an investigative team to determine the cause of the helicopter crash that killed the governor of Puebla and her husband. It has also requested the support of the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board. Mexican authorities have ruled out the presence of explosives in the crashed helicopter. Governor Martha Erica Alonso and the former governor and Senator Rafael Moreno died on Monday, along with 2 pilots and the governor's assistant.
After a thorough and careful analysis of the wreckage of the aircraft, They did not find any explosives or non-combustible substances that exploded inside the aircraft.
And a vigil for the deceased couple has been held in Puebla. Relatives and friends gathered to say their last goodbyes as relatives of the area hope to find out the cause of the accident.
We want the truth. We want this to be clarified so we can be at ease, for everybody's sake, for the sake of Mexico, for the sake of the people in Puebla.
We turn to news of Argentina, where 32.6% of the population live under the poverty line.
There will be little to celebrate this New Year's Eve in thousands of Argentine homes. A third of the country's population live in poverty, a figure which has grown alarmingly in the last 12 months. The new data is overwhelming. 13 million people in the country are in poverty.
With the economic policies that the government are pushing, demonstrations are going to grow. A year has passed and teachers are yet to sign wage agreements. It means the administration is moving forward with its economic model, so protests on the street will continue.
The number of families sleeping on the street is multiplying every day because they don't have the resources to rent a place to live. It's estimated that 10% of the population are on the poverty threshold, which means that close to 2.5 million Argentinians can afford basic amenities.
Mauricio Macri's government wants to keep its policy of starvation, of destroying sources of work, of shutting down schools. He's closing factories and hospitals. He wants to control everything through repression.
The gap between those who have the most with those who have least continues to grow. The rich have more than 31.8%, whilst the poorest have just 1.7%. The wealthiest sector of society have 18 times more income than the poorest.
The people united will never be defeated. Today more than ever, let's work for unity between workers. It's something that you didn't see too often before we had to turn this into a big inclusive national democratic front to defeat this government in the polls, so that the neoliberalism doesn't return to Argentina and we can kick it out of Latin America.
The tough situation poor neighborhoods find themselves in is becoming more evident. Hunger and unemployment are growing. 60% of the population live in areas with the risk of flooding or near landfills. With the flooding in recent days, there's little to celebrate in these holidays.
On Christmas Day, some Peruvians took advantage of the opportunity to settle old disputes by engaging in one-on-one fistfights. The Takanakui Fighting Festival has taken place in Lima, where participants solve their issues on the field, and all of the fights end with a hug. This is a tradition that dates back centuries in the Andean mountains and is aimed at putting an end to disputes. We'll take a short break now, and we'll have more news after this.
With developing events being presented through analysis, our coverage transcends borders. With renowned journalist Walter Martinez.
Salud amigos, tripulantes de nuestra querida, contaminada y única nave espacial.
Dossier. Weekdays. Only on Telesur.
Y ponga usted las cámaras, señor director.
Welcome back. The UN-led team monitoring Yemen's ceasefire has met with government representatives and Houthi rebels in the city of Hodeidah. The UN chief called on both sides to respect the fragile truce and to also implement other agreements reached in Sweden during a week of peace talks. The meeting comes just after some sporadic clashes were reported in Hodeida despite the ceasefire, which began on December 18th.
The timelines are very tight.
And on Monday, the head of the UN monitoring team visited Hodeida's main port and neighborhoods. The monitoring team also visited several key areas in the city, as well as 3 flashpoint front lines south and east of the city. This port city is vital for millions of Yemenis who have been suffering in the 4-year war because aid supplies come through this port.
And not forward.
المفروض انه يكون وقفه يعني خرج اطلاق النار يكون شيء من الماضي مش شيء من المستقبل.
And we have to move forward.
احنا لازم نمشي للمستقبل.
And the reason why there are such short timelines,
والسبب انه هناك جدول قصير او محدود يعني فتره زمنيه قصيره.
Is that we should not lose the momentum of the agreement.
This year was one of the bloodiest for Palestinians. In March, they launched the Great March of Return, which was suppressed brutally by the Israeli army. Another major event of this year was the moving of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which not only angered Palestinians, but also many world leaders.
On behalf of the 45th President of the United States of America, we welcome you officially and for the first time to the Embassy of the United States here in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. Thank you.
As these diplomats from the United States and Israel cheer and celebrate the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, just 70 kilometers away, unarmed Palestinians are being hit by live ammunition from the Israeli army on the Gaza border. Among the victims are women and children. Within hours, at least 60 Palestinians are killed, the highest death toll in 10 years. For these fearless protesters, Israeli weapons cannot stop them from fighting for the right to return to their homeland. And death is the least of their worries.
I got injured at the border, and even though I was hurt, I still returned to the separating fence. We aren't afraid of their snipers, not even of their tanks.
I say to Trump and to all the countries who support him transferring the embassy to Jerusalem that this is a huge mistake. Jerusalem is ours, it's not Israel's nor America's, and God willing, we're coming back to Jerusalem and to our land.
By the end of the day, almost 400 Palestinians are wounded in violent attacks at the Gaza-Israeli border. Bloodshed on an unprecedented scale.
Most of the injuries sustained are from live bullets. Many of the victims were shot in the lower and upper parts of their bodies.
What caused Palestinians to risk taking bullets and gunfire was the changing of the status of the city they call their future capital, East Jerusalem. And historically, Jerusalem is sacred for the world's 3 great religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. By moving the embassy of the United States and recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, President Donald Trump made it very clear he's taking the side of Israel and encouraging brutal violence against the Palestinians, who are left with no options but to stand up against their aggressor. Palestinian children trade their childhood to face the Israeli bullets because they too believe their future lies in their land under their rule.
Protesting brothers could not carry me because if they helped me, then the Israeli army would shoot them. Someone tried to pick me up, but the stretcher was too far, like 10 meters away. So he started to run, and while he ran, I felt like my leg was falling off.
Even before this political statement of moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem happened in May, a massive wave of protests known as the Great March of Return had begun at the Israel-Gaza border on 30th of March, the anniversary of Land Day. It was on this day in 1976 that Israeli police shot and killed 6 Palestinians for protesting against the Israel's government's expropriation of land. So when the Palestinians launched their Great March of Return, they were met with extreme violence from the heavily armed Israeli forces.
I call today for the United Nations to immediately start to provide international protection to the Palestinian people in the face of these daily aggressions. I blame the Israeli occupation for all of today's casualties caused by the occupation army facing peaceful protests.
The brutality against Palestinians also drew international condemnation.
Israel has denied that excessive use of force was used. What we have, from what we have documented, is certainly that the killings and the injuries do actually point to an excessive use of force, and in particular lethal force. And that's in a situation where there was no threat of death or serious injury. And that's why we've made this call.
Since March 30th, the Great March of Return has continued every Friday. Palestinians have gathered in their thousands to build pressure on the Israeli authorities. Israel's attack on the protesters have led to the death of at least 195 Palestinians. More than 10,000 have been wounded. But the protests are not optional for the Palestinians. It is a way of life imposed on them. Their identity is rooted in the land their ancestors lived on. All they are asking for is to get what belongs to them. That is the aim of the Great March of Return.
Japan is set to resume commercial whaling after saying it will withdraw from the International Whaling Commission. Commercial operations will begin again in July 2019 for the first time in 30 years. The Whaling Commission plays a vital role in marine conservation. Despite international condemnation, Japan maintains that whale numbers have recovered.
It has become clear to anyone's eyes that it is extremely difficult for the current IWC to achieve the dual objectives of the sustainable use and protection of whales.
And finally, we end with layers of snow that could be mesmerizing for many, as it was for two giant pandas in China. These two panda sisters was filmed swinging and rolling in the snow in a safari park in Edo City, north of China. But as the region hasn't seen huge snowfalls since winter began, the park brought in artificial snow specially for the pandas to enjoy. Lucky them. We've come to the end of this news brief. For these and many other stories, you can find them on our website at tellusenglish.net. For viewers in Africa, you can find us on Star channel 461 in South Africa and channel 539 in Nigeria. Everyone, however, can follow us on social media because we can be found on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Tell Us Your English, I'm Soini Green. Thank you for watching.